Welcome to the Open Internet Pod, live on X, and also available afterwards as a video on demand on YouTube every Thursday, 12 p.m. UTC. Also available as an audio podcast on your favorite podcast app. Today, as always, I am joined by Richard Paris, co-founder of Sato, and we thought we would do something interesting today, as opposed to all the other times where we don't do things that are so
I was
interesting.
about to jump in and say that.
But we thought that today we'd take a little different approach, especially considering this idea of Sato Vision 26, which the Sato project presented last week. And we thought, like, okay, let's think a bit about what it means to be a visionary today. And I think it also piggybacks a bit on the discussion we had last time about the performative song and dance that happens in the startup world, and how much of that has, actually I put it, trickled over into this visionary aspect of it. And as the world goes all in on AI, there seems to be this lack of vision outside of the notion of number go up. And we're just wondering, are we tricking ourselves into thinking that the technology will deliver the vision instead of having the vision and then building the technology around it, right? So that's going to be the broad topic of discussion. But before we get into all of that, there's some news that we thought were quite interesting and wanted to chat a bit about before we get going. I think for me, the news item that hits home the closest is this. After Chrome, now it's Edge's turn to kill uBlock Origin, and it brings back this idea that we keep hammering on about, that the browser is literally the only place left where you're free on the internet,
and it's hanging on by its fingernails sometimes. Yeah. No. This is classic weasel words, right? So Chrome did it first, and of course Google are not going to be keen on an ad blocking tool when they're basically an advertising company, an ad delivery company. And yeah, they're saying, oh look, the tech behind this is, we've got this new, more secure version of plugins. And when it comes down to it, basically the thing that ad blockers do, i.e. sit in a certain place in the request when your browser wants to do something and put the ads in, they'll block the ads from coming in rather. They're just their new, more secure version of the plugin framework means you can't do that. Surprise, surprise. So, and different browsers are slowly, Chrome-based browsers are slowly turning this off. So Google did it first, Microsoft are doing it now. And I think there's a bunch of stuff, aside from just feeling insulted that you're being told this is a security thing. There are security things in the change. Like, obviously you upgrade software to deal with security challenges, but they didn't have to do it this way. It's also just like productivity, hit to all the people out there who are downloading ads they don't want to see, being distracted by ads they don't want to look at, having them interfere with a page, and being told there's nothing you can do about that. And I think that's, it's just another step in the, kind of, it's like there's a crack in the wall of enshittification, and they're just jamming something in there to stop us getting away from it, right? To stop the goodness leaking in.
But I think your thoughts are directionally correct. I think that we are witnessing a bit of a, I wouldn't say come to Jesus moment, but a bit of a realization moment that there's only so much you can grow. And then it becomes a bit like the thing that Netflix did, where you could share passwords. And then it's like, we need to grow more. So now it does all these checks and doesn't let you share passwords. And all of a sudden, when they have to choose between what the consumer needs and their bottom line, they seem to choose the bottom line more and more. But my idea is that the more people do this, the more incentives you have to find alternatives, right? And I feel like in between all these open source projects that are coming up, all the liberalization or coding with AI, all the modules that are being like primitives are being built and so on, I think that we are on the precipice of a new world of internet. And how that might look like.
Yeah, I think it's coming to pass. Firefox, made by Mozilla, an open and free browser, couldn't ask for a bigger gift than ad blocking being halted everywhere else. Because if you create a plain old web page, a simple 1996 kind of web page, or even a pretty rich game page or something, Firefox and Chrome don't look that different. It's different. A browser is a browser, right? Like it's a page, your bar, and you have your stuff happening. The difference is the actual experience you have when you wander the real internet, and this is making that difference much, much stronger, because it's about giving people the tools they need to make that a pleasant experience versus, just a shit show, basically. And so I think it's, in some ways, it's a gift on that line. And I think you can see that with Windows 11 being so awful, just your ads in the operating system. That it's no surprise Steam went a different direction. They found Linux. So, it's not like Steam and Valve loved Linux all this time. They just found a useful open tool. And people are now reporting 10% of computers are now Linux, 10% of, user computers. This is
Wow,
a
they got
very
to
big
10%
change.
already.
Yeah, some people are debating the numbers, because it's more than one of the reporting agencies is saying this, one of the reporting groups, but it's possibly, in part because agents tend to run on Linux, so they run on VMs that run Linux. So, and it's harder to tell them from traditional crawlers or
Right.
bots or whatever. Someone's agents that's looking something up for them. But even then, it's still doubled in a year, even if you took, aggressive about taking away what you think might be agent traffic. And I also think that's also a separate topic, maybe, but agents are becoming the way people use the internet anyway. So what this is telling us is that open tool is also better for that, because it doesn't stop you. Microsoft don't want you using a command line interface because they can't put ads in it. Maybe they could try. So,
I think that what you're hinting at here is that maybe we have reached the end of the line for this sort of business model where there's a big company, they develop this very complex OS, right? There's one or two choices depending on the company that you choose. Because they have a fiduciary duty to their stockholders that they have to provide shareholder value, right? So while that creates a conflict, they have to, by law, align with the shareholders, right? They are obligated to provide shareholder value. So obviously, the part they're going to squeeze is going to be on the user side, and you have this like perfect storm of the fact that it's easier and easier uh, to try different operating systems. There's new operating systems coming up. You have Graphene OS, which is like a fork of Android, and so on. And you end up in a situation where there's how should I put it? Competition is back on the table. It feels like that. Like we're coming back to the spirit of competition. There's alternatives, and some things are better done on the left side, some things are better done on the right side. But what I think is really interesting here is that this sort of competition can also translate in how we use the internet, because I personally would not use the internet without the ad blocker. For me, the internet without ad blocker is unusable. And like I'm thinking of, and maybe you can help me out with this because I'm really curious what you think about this. But I'm thinking like, what would the internet look like if you brought the tactility and the permanence that you'd have in real life? Would you still want to have that relationship with ads? Would you like to have a house where there's like 60% of the things in your house are owned by other companies, but you have to have them in your house for the rest of the 40% to work? That's,
Yeah.
nobody would accept that. But that's where we are now. And that 40% that you actually own is a license.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think like focusing in on ads there, and I've talked about this for a long time, that one of the visions I have for Saito is that you don't get rid of advertising. Not because we love ads, but because it's a good source of revenue. It's a good option, for an organization, an individual, whatever, to make some money from some content, some product, something. It's not, terrible if the local junior soccer team has the local butcher or car dealership or something sponsor them, and they get their name on the jersey or something, and it provides for the sandwiches and the oranges at halftime, right? Like it's a fair deal if it's a fair deal. It's not advertising that's at fault there. And I love the idea of things like, and people sort of look at me like I'm crazy when I say this the first time, but I love the idea of an ad store, right? An opt-in place where an advertiser can provide a clear deal to the viewer, to the consumer, to say, do this survey, watch this video, just read this thing, and at the end, you'll get something for it, or you could double that if you, took a questionnaire about what you just watched or whatever. Because if you look at the economics of it, if you look at what advertisers are paying now for qualified leads through a click, if you just walked up and told them, look, I want to buy a car, tell me about your car, they'd pay you a lot of money to do that, enough that you could pay for all your internet for, a considerable amount of time. And if you go and watch, I think it's the Golden Lions. You've worked in advertising more than me. Like
Golden Lions,
the kind of Academy Awards for ads. There's some brilliant work out there. It's not like ads have to be a gyrating neon glyph in the corner of your internet experience. They can be something that speaks to you, that's interesting, that's humorous. And there's nothing wrong with companies communicating to you they have something to sell. And so to me, like what we see is that the hatred people have for advertising in their internet experience is because of the way it's delivered, and because it's a pincer movement of like trapping you and then skewering you with the ad, right? And that's how people feel. Whereas it could be delivered completely differently, where you could say, look, here's the deal. You can pay $5 for this, or you can watch a 5-second ad. Right? And if that distribution was fair, basically you could watch a 30-second ad and then have hours of whatever it is, because that's what's actually happening now. It's just that money's not going to you, it's going to people who, middlemen basically, who are delivering the ads through ad networks, and who, like you say, are stuck with how much more they can grow. So the only thing they can do is pin you down better and skewer you more times, right? They don't have another growth model. It's all about trapping you into that. And so for me, I think it's really good to think about these things, and it is a kind of a vision. It breaks from what people expect, but it also offers some great freedom, because it would allow you to do things anonymously. Because if you have to pay for something, there's a trail there. But if you just watch some advertising, it may not pay as highly as if you identified yourself, but you might be able to pay for some completely anonymous web browsing that way. And to me, that's a really cool option you don't have in the world right now.
Yeah, and I think that, like, usually these things kind of happen top down, right? Like, we were told how to use the internet, because when we were doing it in the beginning, it was more peer to peer, right? And then Web 2 became kind of like top down. The companies have the servers, you are the users, right? So it's all like downstream from the company. And I think it's a bit like that idea, the empire long divided must unite, the empire long united must divide. And I think we've been long united, and it's time for the, for things to actually to go back into a more like, actually, I put it, modular or dispersed version.
Our grandparents had chickens in the backyard. We've spent 30 years eating processed egg powder, and we're about to discover whole foods and slow cooking. And no, I think you're right. I think there's a trajectory, and I certainly feel right now like it's come to its natural end, because it's very difficult to escape from here. The business models and the markets and the products that are out there now have entrapped themselves, and it takes something very different to get out of that death spiral now. Because those empires have been protecting themselves. They've built such strong walls, etc. And so it's very hard to shift, and so we'll do something quite differently.
It's a very interesting time, because you kind of can feel it. Like, I personally can feel that something's bubbling, right? I feel like, like I'm asking myself, like, are we masking this stagnation of ideas with bigger and bigger numbers, or are we maybe, holding these ideas back because our business model does not allow for that. And I'm wondering, like, how do these things? How much of it is the market push? How much of it is just things happening? Because there's something in the air. I don't know. I can feel it. There's something in there. There's like changes abound, and you kind of
Yeah.
see it like from mesh networks to Sado to
The,
open source to Linux
yeah.
going to like 10% adoption. It's just like it's bubbling.
There's an old joke in the Linux community of like, it's the year of the Linux desktop, and it's been the year of the Linux. That's going to happen this year since
Yeah.
2003 or something, when someone first announced that. And they started at 0.0007 and ended the year at 0.00071% of the user base or whatever. And it's the first time where actually people stop and think when they make that joke now, right? So I was listening to a podcast where those numbers came out. It's where I got them from. And the hosts were kind of laughing, oh, it's finally year of the Linux desktop. And then they stopped, you could tell they stopped to think, well, at what point have we actually had some success here? Is it no longer just a joke? And I think that to me it's that feeling. I have that same feeling, but there's certain data points that are becoming evidence that this sort of stuff is happening. It feels funnily similar to the kind of indie music movement that came out of the kind of just early 80s supremely produced pop, that where every song was a soundtrack to a movie, had merch, and they'd kind of perfected the pop music machine. And then all of a sudden listenership started going down, and some different categories, people just lost interest, and they started going and listening to bands that sounded funny in weird rooms. Grunge and the early alternative stuff, REM or whatever. But funnily enough, some of the stuff that is now played in the supermarket when I go shopping, now that I'm an old man, that was really edgy when I was young.
Yeah.
But and so to me that's actually an interesting. It's the same arc, like the one I was talking about, where you go through your processed food and back to something hopefully at least a little bit better. There are these cycles, and I think we've really hit the kind of peak with this stuff. And I think some of the stuff we see with the regulation around these things is in fact pushed from the major players to try. It's a last-ditch attempt, or one of their last-ditch attempts, to kind of like clamp down on some of the exits, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I was going to bring that up myself, especially in the context of I think the easiest one to pick on. I mean, it's almost it's almost a joke, but whatever you want to give as an example, the easiest way to find a bad example is to first check what the EU is doing. And if they're not doing it, then you can continue your search. But most of the time, you just need to go, what is the latest thing that the EU did? Oh, of course. Like now they're doing specific packaging for all parcels sent to the European Union. You have to have specific packaging for each country that respects the laws and the recycling aspect. So basically, it's like killing all medium enterprises, right? That they cannot afford to have 27 different packages, right? So it's exactly this idea of big business pulling up the ladder after them, right? It's like we can afford this stuff. Like Amazon can afford this. If you're running like a little web store based on affiliate links or something, you might have a bit of difficulty following along. But it's literally like they're doing it in packaging, they're doing it in AI, they're doing it in data centers. And I think like on the surface, it's well intended, but in the depth of it, from history, we know that these are not the people and these are not the ways to fix these things. But what they do manage to do is to push more and more people to like separate the doers from the followers, right? And it kind of like pushes a whole new generation into exploration. Like, I don't like this. What else is out there, right? It's not one of those things that you look for out of your own impulse. You kind of have to be put in a position where like, this is getting ridiculous. This is too much.
Yeah.
And I think that we're seeing those type of things happening more and more. The EU is the easiest example to pick, but I'm sure there's things happening in Australia. I'm sure there's things happening in the UK, in the US, and across the globe. And it's like where do you think, considering all these moving parts and all these trends that are like slowly emerging, where do you think, like, you don't have to answer correctly, but just an idea that the next breakthrough will come?
I think there's a bunch of things I can see happening. One is, I think it'll be a kind of slow breakthrough, but it is the open source thing. I think people are starting to see, and we've had this conversation a little bit before, but they're actually starting to see the very different, just better experience you can have when products are made for people by people, especially when you add in a lot of AI into that mix, and you can start having, essentially bespoke suit software rather than off the rack, but not just off the rack by someone who's trying to get you to do something very specific and puts advertising on your clothes, right? So,
Exactly.
I think there's that side of things, which is really, really big. One of the big reasons for Cider is to make sure that you have rails that support that. Because like we've been talking about the regulatory system being used sideways as a weapon to keep control of things, or to exclude, to pull up that ladder, to exclude other creative forces from challenging, right? So this is the classic sort of thing of, you've got people think, well, he's going on about age verification. What's this got to do with anything? But it means that if you have to have age verification on your website, it means it's just another step that makes it more complicated to put something online. And then if you're actually responsible for that, you might need legal representation. And if you're a 17-year-old kid with a great idea for a cartoon series, you're not going to put it online. You'll go to a provider. And if the provider doesn't think it's fit content or doesn't want to give you any of their profits, that's where you are, right? And so I think what people are seeing and exploring now is different ways of using tech. Like you said, everything from mesh networks, let's get off the actual internet and just share stuff directly with ourselves, with each other, through to just, the current digital version of sharing CDs, or, burned copies of things, or, movies and music and TV, in the office, by handing them to each other. I think kids are starting to do that by making their own content and sharing it on social media. And, the big question is, at what point will the social media companies start wanting a piece of that action? And at what point will the kids just look for something else to use to get out from under that? Because that's the reason they started doing it in the first place. So for me, I think we will see increased attempts, and I very much hope they don't exist, to lock down on stuff like general computing, people having access to devices that can do what they want them to do, and an ever stronger push towards, your devices being like your TV or your dishwasher, like they're built by the company for the experience you're supposed to have with them. And that's it.
One
And I think
way.
we'll see that on one way. And I think we'll see that on one side. And then I think we'll see a lot of creativity and push. And, if I could tell you exactly what that was, I'd be a far wealthier person, because I'd have invested in amazing things before they happened multiple times. But I do have a sense that we'll not recognize the things that people are doing on the internet in the same way that social media didn't occur to people in 2002, or that, the phone, you watch movies set, Terminator was set in 2017 or whatever, and nobody had a mobile phone. If it was made in the 90s, just because it was something people couldn't see. But I think we will see innovations in that direction. And I think it's not necessarily because people want to put in the effort. I think it's because creative people will find a way to be creative outside of the strictures that are being put on them.
Right. I'm trying to think of what would constitute as some sort of like breakthrough in my mind. Like, personally, what I would see or would like to see is a situation where you are no longer like the promise of the internet was to have access to the world, right? And to have access to information, and to have this free flow. Obviously, that was allowed only as long as the US backed companies were doing all this transformation, right? Now, when it's becoming more and more liberal, and people can come in and join, then all of a sudden, nobody wants to do this model because they're not reaping all the benefits, right? So I feel like a breakthrough for me would constitute the natural apparition or rise of some sort of internet private network, like a gated community. Like, for example, let's say I'm on the internet. Let's say I call it the corporate because it's all owned by corporations. But I could also park myself inside this like gated community where maybe I have my friends or a group of friends, or it's like a country club, like a members only, right? And the corporate cannot follow me there because the architecture of that network that I went into imposes such a cost upon them to do that, that it makes no financial sense for them to follow me there. And I feel like this might be what I would consider a breakthrough in terms of internet, like this ability to just be able to hop onto something that looks like the internet, but it's like a private thing, and you cannot be tracked there
It's
and
funny because
followed.
I think some people would think that the country club model is hellish. If you're one of those persons, just put commune or kibbutz in for the same thing. I kind of agree, right? It's a non-corporate space on the internet, and it's community space. It's driven by the participants to be what it is. And I think, variously people have tried to build infrastructure to do this before. So Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who came up with the concept of the web, internet, with hypertext and pages and things, he came up with a kind of information pod thing where you kind of everybody had their own information, etc. And the issue there was, similar to what you're saying, the idea was that you could then share on your own terms with the people that you wanted to, etc., because you had this infrastructure that let you do it. But the issue was it didn't have a way for funding itself, so it needed for people to just pay for this stuff and be fairly adept at managing it. You had to create your pod, and you had to like connect it to other pods and stuff. And so it was kind of it was great on that kind of freedom of use side of things and autonomy, but it was clunky, I think, both on the economics and the usability, because it wasn't a network. So it didn't have easy ways of connecting to other people and sharing information. And it didn't also have easy ways of just getting your hands on the things that you needed, the tooling that you needed to do that. And so I think people have kind of had versions of that hope. Maybe not, I wouldn't call them an idea necessarily in all cases, but the sort of hope for this sort of idea of, how about a place where it's not just this relentless set of, you versus the business models in your everyday life. And to me, that's, again, a driving vision in what I do every day. Like, this is what I want to set up for people, is the ability to have something where they are paying for their usage, but that money is directed without intermediaries to the people providing infrastructure. But those infrastructure providers don't, at the same time, don't have any saying sort of what they're doing. They're just providing literally machinery to drive this. So they're not providing you with a website or with a service that they determine what it is. Each and every layer of that is separate, and people are just doing what they need to do in that layer. To me, that's very, very exciting. It sounds a bit dull, but what it means is you've protected each layer from being exploited by the next. And so that user experience at the top is just your user experience.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I feel that this sort of business model was dependent on, let's just say, call them maybe economies of scale. Like compute had to get to a certain price, like internet infrastructure, all these little bits had to get to a certain price where that sort of architecture would make sense. And I feel like we built our business model in a different era where the costs were so high that it made sense to have these like centralized operators, because that was like the cheapest way to get everybody in.
Things like databases were hard to do, and you needed to pay specialists a lot of money to run them, right? So, like running websites was a professional job because you couldn't do it successfully or, well without a team. And that means scale, like you say.
Yeah. And I feel like I think there's like all these little like when you look at a producer's table and they have all these volume sliders, right? So they're all like moving, and then I think they're coming closer and closer to this like Goldilocks area where everything clicks. But I think it does require maybe a generation of people that have grown up with the broken version of the internet that we have today, right? And they say like, you know what, enough of that. Let's build
Well,
something else. Let's try something new.
I think maybe also, but fully literate, right? So you still got like people my age still remember pre-internet. And so we're still kind of held back by some conceptions because we're still surprised that things work in some ways. Like, oh, look at that works, right? Whereas people who grew up, who were born post.com, right? People in their early 20s now, and younger, they have very different expectations and different appreciation for what the role that this tech plays in their lives and stuff. And I think this is something I've gone on at people about a lot is if you look at new technologies, they embed in societies in interesting ways and slowly. So like the phone, when it arrived, was the rudest thing in the world, right? The whole house would stop doing what they're doing because the phone rang and someone would run up to attend to the phone god and ask it what it wanted and find the person it needed. And that just seems absurd now. But when mobile phones came along, people thought, oh, well, that's even worse because now the phone god follows you around. Right. Whereas what we've ended up with is, I think, a much more civilized thing where you text first. You up for a call? It's become much more polite. So the sort of thing where people feared this sort of the technology, it was actually an adaptation thing where, people who had old school wired phone mentality just didn't adopt the mobile phone in the way maybe that younger people have, or what the rest of us have once we've had it for 10 years. But, there's for a lot of young people, the idea of calling someone before you've texted to just check if they're up for it or whatever, unless there's context, just seems bizarre. And to me, that's like just showing a higher level of maturity, but also it's more native to them. It's like they've fitted it in, culture's moved on, it's adapted around that technology. And I think one of the things that we'll see from the next generation is, although by and large they'll be following and have their expectations set by what they've seen, they'll also take for granted maybe that they can control and change and shape things and want to do things with the technology. And I certainly hope so.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and it's it's really funny how this old technology, because I mean, like the internet was first created was very, very bare bones, and I don't think we improved it much since. Um, but I mean, when I look at it, I also think of what are our current needs and what are things that could happen in the future. Like, for example, do I feel that I have a relationship with the authorities in my jurisdiction, which allows me to have high trust in them so that they can, take care of my personal information, take care of my identity, right? Do I really want that to be something where somebody else has the on and off switch? Or do I want that to be sitting with me and I can provide for my own identity? And then, for some system, it can be verified that I am who I say that I am. But at the same time, when I look at social changes in especially in the West, where there's a continuous degradation of the relationship between the state and the individual, that doesn't make me feel safe. And I feel that in this last ditch attempt to like grab the power, they will through no, I should put it, without realizing, they will create a situation where people will just look for the exit. And if there is no exit, they'll develop it. And I'm just wondering, is that going to be the catalyst? Is that going to be the little spark? Because now it's just like bubbling. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there's different ways I can see it going. So, I mean, the big thing is, and people are getting, I think, clear. This is another thing I've been feeling over the last year and a half. It's becoming more and more clear. It's becoming a far more common and general discussion point of the capture of politics in the West by an elite class of super rich who both managed to evade the tax system, but then also started to capture politics in order to benefit themselves, basically, to protect themselves from competition, to embed their wealth, to do various things, just come up with outcomes that they want. And so you have this degradation of the relationship between most people and the state, because the state is not acting in their behalf, and it's not responding to their needs, etc. And you can clearly see that with things like cost of living now and buying power, but also just freedom and ability to do certain things. And yeah, I think it's really interesting because this is sort of you can extrapolate and get very different results. One possibility is that, and it is supposed to be the strength of democracy, is that this sort of stuff can happen, but you're kind of always in terrible mode and you muddle through, and that at some point this will cause a democratic backlash that cannot be countermanded by capture of the current political state. So we'll see things that are revolutionary, at least within the context of the last 75 to 100 years, of like political parties that just seem like part of the structure of the country just vanishing as they lose complete trust and so forth. And then there's a question of which way that goes. Does it tend to fascism, where these controls get ramped up and used without fear or favor, and just without even the dressings of good governance? Or do we see a revolution where things are thrown open, and where there's I don't have the ability to predict that. I certainly hope for something that doesn't involve any dark extended periods of the kind that we saw in Europe in the 30s and 40s, and we've seen elsewhere. We certainly see tendencies towards that, but it's not political podcast in that sense. So I'm not going to go projecting on in those directions. But I think we'll certainly see movements towards getting out from under that system and escaping, not just through political means. I think in the end it'll come down to a lot of politics. And the question is, in some ways, for moving freely on things like the internet, is, do the mesh network people become our heroes? Does the ability, and that sounds really crazy. Now, what I'm talking about there, for people who may not understand what we're talking about, there's a lot more people, there's a growing number of people who are looking at using cheap radios that are available on AliExpress, or even at your local Radio Shack type organization, whatever that is now, the Walmart, where you can hook them together and you can start sending data across them and messaging in the way that the internet does, but without the corporate-owned internet infrastructure. You're just setting up a club that does this, or some kind of organization. And the fact that that's getting more and more popular, it's not just like, oh, ham radio's fun. There's a lot, there's a lot of intent behind this, that people want to have a backup for communications outside of an internet that is fragile in certain points. And I think hooray for them, because this is something that Cyto could run on if the internet is, split into pieces, or, we have to end up with internet passports to get online, et cetera, et cetera. So it's good to have these ways of, even using that just to interconnect pieces of the internet that technically shouldn't be, theoretically. So I certainly see movements in that direction. My hope is that the necessity for that doesn't come about, that there's political change at some level where people start saying, is this really where we want to go? And why are we implementing these sort of controls? Like, is it, and that we just see a bit more consciousnesses around this sort of thing, and so people start disambiguating and understanding what they're being told about, for instance, whether it's terrorism or protect the kids. So they're starting to question these reasoning, and then actually look in, for instance, when they hear that, ask specific questions, or start digging into this legislation. How does it actually achieve these things that you're saying, and does it? Because that's often the case. Like, things are put up as legislation to regulate the size of eggs is sold as something to do with protecting the children, because it's just an easy way to get it through, right? It could be anything. So I really hope we see some quicker, less destructive outcomes along that path. We're building for both. We're building for something that creates even an economy around running USB sticks around to provide information between groups who want to communicate, if that's the last resort. That's important to me as well.
I think that there's a few things in what you said that really struck a chord with me. And the main one being that what I thought was very interesting in the Chinese model is that they created the everything app. Like it started with the chat app, then you got payments, then you got the storefronts, and then you got the social, and it kind of like built that way, right? And I feel like in today's world or where we're heading now, I think the everything app is maybe the everything network. And it's the network that can, like you said, it can run on a mesh, it can run on the internet infrastructure, and then maybe in the future when there's something else developed, it can run on that as well. But the environment remains the same. And I see this also with stuff like crossover, which is a software that lets you play Windows games on a Mac or Windows apps on a Mac. And Crossover can become one of these everything apps. Like, right, you can run Crossover on Linux, and then you have access to both Mac OS and Windows. And then the app itself becomes the environment in which everything runs. And I feel like some version of an open source crossover with a network that is also of similar form and structure. I think that could be my vision of this future of internet and software.
I mean, in some ways, the right way to do that is browsers that are just not specifically TCP/IP internet browsers in the way that we have them now. Similar thing to a browser, but it runs on all that hardware you're talking about, and it runs on different networks. So it understands your mesh network and lets you address things on that network, as well as understanding getting and receiving data in files or in packets somehow. It does all of those things. So you can, like you say, you can have your same environment and take that and port that around, and that applications can be delivered into that as well. And that's why I like the idea of it being very browser-like, because you can, a browser these days is essentially a way of delivering apps on demand rather than you going via a store, which has benefits beyond not just needing to go to the store, in that, you don't end up with the gatekeeping and controls that a store requires.
The browser today is way more than what the browser used to be back in the day. I mean, you can run Figma in your browser, you can run Microsoft, you can run all the Gmails, I mean, all the Google apps and so on. So the browser is very, very powerful.
We do this podcast in a browser, and it gets
Exactly.
mixed and edited in one, right? So
yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's the browser is a very powerful, and it's a very powerful bastion of internet freedom, and we kind of like have to live and die by it in a way, because it's where it began, and it could also end there if we're not careful and we allow this kind of creep to come in. First it's Chrome, then it's Edge. And I feel that's where the problem is, because they have this like salami tactic of just slice a little slice every other day, and then before you know it, they cut up the whole salami. If they just would cut up big bits at the start, then you would notice it, but it's just like slowly boiling the frog.
You've got very interesting things, and they were, interestingly, in China, they were on the very edge of regulatory permission to do this. But they created this WeChat watch for kids. So the idea is it was sold to parents, and it had no operating system. It just ran WeChat, just the everything app. And it was actually a kid's version, so it cut down to just allow what the parents had said was okay. And it was essentially a tracking and safety device for your kids. So you slap this watch on and they can always call you. You can GPS locate them if they go missing, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that got to me about that was not anything to do with whether that's a good idea or not, but simply this idea of, it was the first time I'd seen, and there was the Chromebook, but that's still the browser mentality. This was different. This was, you have one app. Like, this was a device which it turned it on and it booted into that app. That's all there was. Right. So it made calls, but they were WeChat calls. You could chat to people, but it was only in WeChat. You could buy stuff, but it was only in approved WeChat mini apps. And so it was just, very functional, but absolutely walled garden. Like, it's gone, there's a sort of point at which curation turns into something quite different. And it was well past a curated experience. It was a very deliberately controlled experience. And I think that actually got knocked on the head in China because of regulators, funnily enough, saying this is just too much of a monopoly thing. You can't sell a device that is just your app. You have to sell general purpose phones. But then again, they're still, gated, but it's just they've decided to put it a different place. It's gated at the App Store, not the not the app itself.
Device.
Yeah. But, I think you can see so many ways in which that's the kind of wet dream for a company, and they're trying to get into those sorts of things via sidelines. So there's always a hope with wearables or something that, if you're wearing your AR glasses all the time, then that's not a computer, right? And it's not a phone. So we can just give you this like unitary experience in that. And the hope being that you could then own the entire experience. That's how people see the world literally, and you own that whole experience. So I think, the browser is super important because it's our last way out of that. And I don't think people understand how important Firefox is for the fact that it keeps the standards running as open, because ever since the start of the internet, we've had companies, Microsoft Internet Explorer was the king of them all, but Chrome does the same thing where they try and bend applications and things to match their browser in a way that makes other browsers less usable and less functional in an attempt to gain monopoly. And that's been a constant war that I don't think many people realize the role Firefox and Mozilla played in protecting us from a pretty dark internet future back in the day by keeping an alternative available and representing, so that there was a constant argument that you needed something else available to keep that whole thing from just turning into a unitary block, which Chrome almost is, and then from there turning into a complete monopoly, complete control, and then the resulting enshittification we know and love.
Yeah, it's very, how should I put it? I don't want to say interesting, but it's very eye-opening to see that everybody just wants to get to this point where they can create a monopoly, right? There's nobody wants to have like healthy competition. Nobody wants to be one of the many. Everybody wants to own the market, and you can understand why, but you can also understand how that is not really consumer friendly. So getting to strike that balance, it becomes one of these things where, like, how do you allow enough control on the, let's say, on the user side, or enough control on the business side, and balancing that relationship in a way that cannot be gamed. I think that can be a very, very nice moat to have, especially if you can do that on the network level.
Yeah, I mean that's why you need to build it in there, because the state, and like most of we were bashing Europe before, and we probably won't stop, but the good things that they've done regulatory wise have been antitrust type stuff recently. They've put some muscle into saying, well, wait a minute, partially just because they've realized how far behind the US they are suddenly, now that they might want to consider trying to have their own sort of sovereignty on the internet. Looping back, it's we've seen and we know that, like, this is, we talked about it last week, this is the compulsion of the business models that exist out there. And those are executed by companies and individuals with so powerful and so much money that they start to capture the state and either collaborate or force more and more of this restriction in there. Combination of, security, so we'll get rid of the ad blockers, but then at the same time, we'll put in this sort of age verification stuff so that any OS provider needs a team of thousands. So open source, try and clamp down on open source that way, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I feel like people are starting to see why wonks like me, David, were talking. When we saw Bitcoin, we didn't see money. Like we saw that possibility, but my immediate thought was, you can't do that, right? You can't pervert the network underneath because it's ownerless, right? And so there isn't even a political way in. You can't capture the politics of this thing. And to make that happen, you need to make sure that you can't capture the economics of that thing. And that's why we said about building what we built, because when you have the something that can regulate itself through the self-interest and of all of the participants, then, and it's not doing regulation in terms of making decisions. It's just preventing anything from undermining those basic rules, those sort of constitutional components of it. They're unalterable. And so, there's nothing stopping you building an app on Cider that needs a user login or something that's completely against the philosophy, but people will reject it and they don't have to accept it, right? That's the difference. They always have a guaranteed way out.
While listening to you, it brought back this idea of business friendly and monopoly or oligarch resistant. But it also made me think of it in a different way. It could be business friendly and anarchy resistant, right? Like all these behaviors which would go against the established norm that we all think are like, we agreed to these things, right? And then all of a sudden somebody goes outside of that, and it happens over and over again. That can lead to a state of anarchy because there is no longer a consensus on what we agree on. So not only is it monopoly resistant, but it's also anarchy resistant. Is that am I getting anywhere with this, or?
Absolutely not. I'm going to pull out my Kropotkin and hit you with it. No,
Okay,
no. I think
go for
I
it.
see where you're coming from. I sort of see it as pro-anarchy in the sense that you can have something anarchic that's not problematic, right? So, as you know, I went through my why doesn't
Anarchy light.
anarchism work? Right. Phase as a philosophy student and as a young person, it's a very good question to ask. To me, it's something you should ask yourself. Why couldn't we just do that? Right? What do we get out of states, etc., that makes it better than some of the various and anarchistic models that have been pushed? And I think the problem is that you know the kind of classic anti-libertarian line, well, who's going to pay for the roads, right? It is actually that kind of question, right? If anyone can do whatever they want, that's the point you're getting at, where you have no guarantee that things will interoperate, right? That no guarantee that anything will work. And I think in a way, what you want is something that lets you have that freedom, but without that causing the problems. So it creates certain standards. From sound German anarchist. We need anarchism with
Rules of
standards.
engagement.
It sounds like an anarchist that works at the German Deutsche Industry Norm. Yeah. What we need is paper that's exactly this shape. So we can write our manifestos and then bind them into nice, neat binders. It's that kind. It's. I'm getting silly now, but no, I think that it's really important that you have that. Exactly that, right? Something that allows for creativity by guaranteeing certain prerequisites for communication of that creativity and coordination of that creativity. So that kind of business friendly oligarch proof. It could also be the same. So creativity friendly, but not a mess, right?
Mm.
Right.
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 Yeah.
It provides a substrate that keeps the playing field ordered, level, etc. So you can build on it whatever crazy things you want, and people can, the determinism. What determines the success of those things is whether people like them. There's not a way of capturing them and saying we have to use this one. It prevents both the oligarch from taking that over and a completely dysfunctional, I don't know if we're talking buildings, city, because none of them connect properly and they don't have roads between them, etc. Right. So that to me is the kind of reason you want something like Cider. It's not that you couldn't achieve the same thing with like perfect regulation, except you don't have that, and it's never going to happen, right? You don't perfect participation. That's also not going to happen.
It's also the fact that you don't always have to sit there and wonder if they're going to change the law the moment you turn around, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can have a law that you're happy with, but then there are like 5% of the people that are not happy with it because they have some, business interests, or they have some plans for some expansion and so on. And they're like, wait, if we go through the normal process, we're going to get voted down all the time. But if we just, grease the wheels and get the politicians to go with us, then we can change the rules, right? And you don't have that anymore when you have a consensus, because you cannot do that. And if you try to take over the network, you will pay more than what it's worth. So it creates this like peace of mind on these few things that are constitutional in order to build anything on top of it, right? It's to have this like security that these basic constitutional laws will not change the moment I turn my back.
The thing that consensus provides at that level is at both extremes and everywhere in between the system works. So one extreme is if you only have one person, complete centralization. If you only have one person providing all of the infrastructure, they can't misuse that power. They can't censor, they can't change anything about what's going on. At the other end, if you have every single person running their own piece of that infrastructure, it still works and it can still communicate. So all the way through that, you allow for whatever natural forms of interaction and operation occur between people who want to do that. People can form clubs, they can form companies, they can go solo. The company can't bully the solo operator because they don't have control of the data centers and the underlying pipes. So they can't deny people access to that. They can't jack up the price, or it's a way of just making that playing field level and functional at both of those ends. So I think that's kind of an extension of what you're saying about it lets anyone set up a business and be successful at any scale without that impinging on other people, because they can't do things like politically capture the system and then make skew it in their favor at this point.
It'd be very interesting to see business behavior in such an environment. And if you'd get the same impetus towards starting businesses, right? Because all of a sudden you would know that at the top end, you would only be able to keep yourself there through competition and delivering. So you could not become incumbent. You could not pull the ladder up with you. And it would be very interesting to see how people react to that and how.
I mean, I think it's very interesting because I think it would just take those hyperscale business models out of the picture. So I think if you look at like everyday objects, like chairs, you'd have to say that the world we live in now has far less artistry. I think some great design. I'm not a fan of Louis XIV chairs or whatever, but things used to be handmade, right? And you used to be able to make a living making chairs in your village. And so there was more artistry around. There were probably also more ugly chairs, but I think you'll see that in the business world. There'll be more ability to just start small businesses and be satisfied with them. And I think what will happen is where that really works for people, like restaurants and media and stuff like that, that's what we'll see. It's not going to make airlines like mum and dad businesses. That's not going to happen. Although in rural areas, it might let people share planes and things in interesting, kind of create rideshare options and stuff that don't exist now. But I think what you'll see is a ability to have businesses kind of scale to fit and also have a broad variety of options. Right. So have a kind of natural bell curve of business sizes in any given field, having a lot of small players, a rump of medium-sized players, and then maybe one or two very big players, depending on what it is, retail or certain things where, you'll have far more local grocery options, local things like that. Creative businesses can be one-person shows or a collaborative, whereas, an airline or something like that is obviously going to be a big entity. It's not, the physical things it's doing require thousands of people and lots of money. But what it stops doing in the internet side of things is having internet companies use their vast, revenue to change the game on everybody else.
Exactly. Okay, to close out the show,
yes,
I would like to ask you one question, and we can both answer it. But I can start it and say, like, what is in your opinion, your hottest take for things that can happen in the next 5 years? Mine would be that I think that the attention economy will fizzle out in the next 5 years. That's my hot take. What would yours be?
It's kind of similar, actually. I think that the attention economy will flip into the instead of having creators being within tools, I think it'll flip to the meta. I think it'll be people creating actual things, changing the shape of stuff, right? And I think it'll be largely AI driven. So I think what we'll see is the development of strong bases that people can vibe code on, so that you don't need to be the engineer that can actually hook the pipes together, but platforms where people can create. And I think that'll take a lot of the fizz out of the kind of attention economy stuff that you're talking about, because people will have alternatives and you won't be driven into one of three things that are all giving, basically turning into streams of content.
Will these platforms that allow you to create be closed or open?
I think they'll be both, and the closed will lose because, like open, science just outperforms closed research.
Because China.
Well, China's just worked out that physics is in their favor if they play the game that way, right? They just realized it's the right way to do it. And I think, Spicy, a great Citizen Spicy Card, posted about, he thinks, Google's really actually right in the lead in the AI race right now, despite people laughing at Gemini. And I totally agree with him, because if you look at what most people will use AI for most of the time, it's that experience about delivering it, right? Delivering it into people's lives and the surface area of users you have. I think that those closed players, even if they have great products, will be stuck, right? They'll still have to, they'll have an agenda that will make that not work, and they'll have shareholders they need to please, etc. Whereas I think once we get past the point that what we think of as leading edge models now require heavy compute, and that's sort of something every laptop can do, then that's going to be no advantage to closing that stuff up, because people will just start building building underneath it anyway. And guess what? It turns out people have already built open platforms that let you do that.
All right. So a hot take from Richard there is that you will all be able to create your own apps, and it'll be easier and easier.
The simplest thing to do, the simplest way I think about it, is websites, right? Like, it used to be a thing. Now you can just say, robot, make me a website, right? And simple ways of putting that online will be more and more common, I think.
And on that bombshell, it's time for us to end another episode of the Open Internet Pod. Thank you once again, Richard, for your time, and thank you to everybody who's been watching us on X. Don't forget to share this, and don't forget to check out the Open Internet Pod on your favorite pod app and on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.